For most of human history, when we looked for the biggest things on Earth, we looked up at mountains and across forests. We measured the tallest trees and the widest deserts, we counted cities and highways, and we imagined scale in terrestrial terms. That habit of looking only at land left a profound blind spot. The ocean has always held structures of a scale that dwarf almost anything on land, living systems so vast and so old that, until very recently, we simply did not know how to see them. What follows is not a list of curiosities. It is an argument. The largest coherent living systems on our planet are, in many cases, underwater, and their size, age, and ecological importance force us to rethink how we measure life on Earth. Start with the most famous example, because it is both obvious and easily misunderstood. The Great Barrier Reef stretches along the northeastern coast of Australia for more than 1,000 miles and covers hundreds of thousands of square kilometres. It is visible from space and, by conventional measures, remains the largest coral reef system on the planet. It is a living, growing structure composed of billions of tiny animals, coral polyps that together build calcium carbonate frameworks the size of islands and continental margins. That reef system alone reshapes how we think about biological scale. It demonstrates that life, acting slowly and collectively, can construct forms that rival human-built systems in footprint and complexity. But the ocean's claim to largest living things does not stop with corals. In Western Australia, a seagrass meadow found in Shark Bay has been identified as one of the world's largest single organisms by area, a clonal colony, one genetic individual spanning tens of square kilometres, a living system that has been cloning itself for millennia. This single organism, stretching across a landscape of shallow water and sand, is not merely large in area. It is a continuous living network that supports food webs, stabilizes sediment, and stores carbon at scales seldom appreciated outside scientific circles. When a single plant can extend for tens of square kilometers, our definition of largest has to shift. Kelp forests and macroalgae belts add a different kind of magnitude. On temperate coastlines, giant kelp can form dense floating canopies that are functionally forest-like, providing vertical habitat and supporting diverse communities. In the open ocean, drifting macroalgae, like sargassum, have formed recurring belts that stretch thousands of kilometers, a living mass that migrates with currents and feeds entire pelagic ecosystems. These masses are not static monuments the way a coral reef is. They are living, moving systems whose scale becomes apparent when seen from satellites and oceanographic surveys. The Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, for example, has been tracked extending for thousands of kilometers across the tropical Atlantic in some years, carrying millions of tons of biomass and altering coastal ecologies when it reaches shore. Systems such as these challenge the terrestrial bias of largest by adding temporal and spatial dynamism to biological scale. Beneath the sunlit surface lies a quieter, less obvious kind of enormity, vast sponge grounds and cold water coral fields that stretch across continental margins and seamount slopes. These are not tropical reefs. They are deep, slow-building, and often ancient ecosystems. Recent research has found dense sponge gardens on Arctic shelf breaks, on the Canadian margin, and on seamount slopes around the world. In many places, these sponge assemblages form structural habitats that rival shallow reefs in ecological importance, providing settlement surfaces, nursery habitat, and food for associated megafauna. They can cover hundreds, even thousands, of square kilometers in aggregate. And because they persist where sedimentation is slow and currents concentrate food particles, they become living monuments to steady, long-term ecological engineering. Cold water corals and so-called mound provinces are another form of hidden gigantism. Modern mapping and ROV surveys have revealed nearly continuous fields of coral mounds extending for hundreds of kilometers, particularly along the Blake Plateau off the southeastern United States, where cold water coral mounds form large habitats with complex three-dimensional structure. These features accumulate over thousands of years and in aggregate create networks that are functionally comparable to coral reefs on tropical shelves, but far deeper, colder, and older. Recent multi-partner mapping efforts have revealed some of the largest known extents of these mound fields, forcing a re-evaluation of where the ocean holds concentrated biological architecture. What all of these examples have in common is slow time. Plants and animals in these systems do not grow at the pace of human construction. They grow at the pace of centuries and millennia. A deep-water coral might accrete only millimeters a year. A sponge field may accumulate biological structure over thousands of years. That slowness is deceptive. It makes these systems resilient in some ways, but also uniquely vulnerable because human impacts that destroy physical structure, bottom trawling, industrial seabed disturbance, rapid warming erase centuries of accumulated life in a single event. The very slowness that creates monumental scale is what makes recovery measured on human timescales almost impossible. The surprise for many people is not only how large these systems are, but how long they remained hidden from science. There are several reasons for this invisibility. First, much of the ocean is simply unreachable by conventional means. Darkness, cold, and crushing pressure have historically limited observation to the shallowest margins. Second, technological bias-focused exploration on navigation and shipping lanes rather than on ecological mapping. For centuries, instruments measured depth, not biological architecture. Third, the seafloor records are often subtle old riverbeds or terraces, look geological at a glance unless you have high-resolution mapping tools and targeted sampling. Only with the recent explosion of multibeam sonar, autonomous vehicles, satellite imagery, coupled with more sophisticated algorithms and large multi-institutional surveys, have we begun to see the real, three-dimensional structure of life beneath the waves. In short, the ocean always had these systems. We have only now developed the tools to witness them. To understand the scale of a single system, return to the Great Barrier Reef as a reference point and then consider the alternatives. It is the largest coral reef system, certainly, but when we ask about largest living systems more broadly, several candidates appear: clonal seagrass meadows covering dozens of square kilometers, kelp forests that create vertical habitat across tens of kilometers of coastline, pelagic macroalgae belts stretching thousands of kilometers, sponge and cold water coral provinces covering continental slopes, even microbial mats and biofilms at abyssal thermal vents that shape localized chemistry on an industrial scale. The lesson is that largest is a category with many dimensions: area, biomass, continuity, age, and the influence exerted across ecological networks. To make the argument visually compelling for an audience, imagine placing these systems side by side: a reef you can walk on, an underwater forest that moves with the waves, a meadow the size of a small country, and a sponge ground that has accumulated life for millennia. All are living. All are massive, and each redefines how life distributes itself on our planet. We can illustrate the argument with three focused case studies that show variety of form and function: a seagrass meadow that is a single genetic organism, an extended deep water coral field that rivals shallow reefs in area, and a sponge ground whose living architecture underpins entire continental ecosystems. Each provides a different reason to call the ocean home to the planet's largest living systems. First, the seagrass case. In Shark Bay, Western Australia, scientists documented a single Posidonia seagrass clone that spans tens of square kilometers and has persisted and reproduced clonally for thousands of years. This meadow is not an aggregation of individuals in the casual sense. Genetically, it is one organism that has spread via vegetative cloning to form a continuous carpet across the seafloor. Its ecological role is profound. It sequesters carbon, stabilizes sediment, and creates habitat for fish and invertebrates that humans rely on for fisheries and coastal health. When an organism achieves that scale and longevity, it becomes more than a plant bed. It is a foundational ecosystem in its own right. Second, consider cold water coral provinces. These are not the colorful, shallow reefs tourists snorkel on. They are deep, slow-growing assemblages that form three-dimensional mounds and terraces hundreds of meters tall and extending laterally for many kilometers. Mapping campaigns off the southeast continental shelf have identified nearly continuous coral mound provinces extending for hundreds of kilometers. These mounds act as spawning grounds, nursery areas, and biodiversity hotspots in dark water where productivity is otherwise low. Their size when measured across a province rather than a single mound approaches the footprint of terrestrial national parks. They are living monuments to oceanic time and flow. Third, deep-sea sponge grounds show another structural logic. Sponges are among the simplest animals, yet they form complex three-dimensional frameworks that alter local currents, capture particulate food, and provide habitat for species ranging from brittle stars to commercially important fish. Recent studies have documented vast sponge aggregations on shelf breaks and seamounts worldwide, some dense enough to be visible in broad-scale ecological surveys. These grounds are significant for biodiversity, and they are increasingly recognized as priority ecosystems for conservation because their slow recovery rates mean damage can be essentially permanent on human timelines. If we accept that the ocean contains living systems of planetary scale, the next logical question is, why does it matter? There are practical answers and profound ones. Practically, these systems provide ecosystem services at huge scales. They sequester carbon, support fisheries, buffer coastlines from storm energy, and cycle nutrients that sustain ocean productivity. A single seagrass meadow can sequester carbon at rates comparable to terrestrial forests on a per-area basis. Cold-water coral provinces and sponge grounds support food webs that have economic value in fisheries and tourism. The dramatic implication is that the ocean is doing ecological heavy lifting at continental scale, services our economies and societies depend upon even when we cannot see those systems from shore. On a deeper level, these discoveries change our narrative about life on Earth. For centuries, the human story has been land-centric. We grow crops, build cities, invent infrastructure on solid ground. That perspective encourages policies and research that favor terrestrial ecosystems. The new evidence requires humility. Important processes, vast biomass pools, and ancient ecosystems are hidden offshore, and our current models of biodiversity, carbon cycling, and ecological resilience are incomplete without them. When we consider global change, we must include these hidden giants. Their collapse would have measurable consequences for climate feedbacks and food security. Recognizing their role changes priorities for research, conservation, and international policy. The tools that are now revealing these systems matter as much as the systems themselves. Multibeam sonar creates high-resolution maps of the seafloor that reveal contours, terraces, and mound provinces with detail unimaginable a few decades ago. Autonomous underwater vehicles and remotely operated vehicles can linger and film, collect specimens, and sample sediments in places human divers cannot survive. Satellite sensors pick up surface signatures like the floating carpets of sargassum that connect pelagic phenomena to deep processes. And improvements in genetic methods, including environmental DNA EDNA, allow scientists to detect the presence of species and past life even when no obvious structure remains. The narrative becomes, the ocean hid these systems because we lack the map. Now that we have better instruments, the living architecture is no longer invisible. This is also a story of accidental discovery. Many of the largest systems were not deliberately sought as largest living things. They were found while scientists were mapping geology, surveying for resources, monitoring fisheries, or responding to unusual satellite signals. The Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, for example, came into clear view through satellite analysis and then oceanographic follow-up, revealing a moving mass of macroalgae many thousands of kilometers long. Sponge grounds and cold-water coral provinces often appeared as unexpected features on bathymetric maps, prompting targeted ROV work that exposed their living complexity. Discovery in the ocean is often incidental because the ocean is large and expensive to survey. Scientific attention is expensive, and serendipity plays a big role. Recognition of scale carries responsibility. Many of these habitats are already threatened. The Great Barrier Reef is both an icon and a warning. Mass bleaching events driven by warming seas have killed coral at unprecedented scales, eroding the reef structure and the services it provides. Deep systems are threatened by bottom trawling, which can physically scrape away centuries of built habitat in hours, by mining and dredging that clouds sediments and bias nutrient flows, and by climate-driven shifts in ocean chemistry and oxygenation. When a slow-growing deep coral mound is damaged, the rebuilding time may be measured in centuries, not years. Protecting these systems requires policy frameworks that recognize their scale and time depth, and it requires expanding conservation thinking from protected areas of a few square kilometers to networks that account for the vast spatial footprint of these living systems. There is also an ethical dimension. These living giants are not merely resources. They are repositories of evolutionary experiments and ecological complexity that have existed long before our species rose to dominance. They host lineages that predate most modern ecosystems and preserve genetic and functional diversity that may be crucial for future resilience. When we debate ocean policy, it is not enough to tally fish stocks or commodity values. We must ask what is being lost when an underwater forest, meadow, or mound is degraded, because those losses can be irreversible on human timescales. Conservation language must expand to value living structure as well as living biomass. So what does a practical protection strategy look like? First, it must be built on data. Large-scale mapping programs must continue and expand, prioritizing continental margins, known ecological hotspots, and areas flagged by satellite anomalies. Second, fisheries and industrial policies should be adapted to protect structural habitats, no bottom trawling across sponge grounds, restrictions on seabed mining in known coral provinces, strict controls on sediment dumping and coastal runoff. Third, conservation mechanisms should include international cooperation because many of these systems cross national boundaries and economic zones. Global frameworks are required for shared stewardship. Finally, public engagement is essential. If people understand that the world's largest living systems can be underwater, they will value and support protection in new ways. The story of conservation shifts when the public recognizes that a living meadow the size of a small country is at risk beneath their waves. The scientific frontier is also rich with unanswered questions that would make powerful documentary moments. How much carbon is stored by deep seagrass meadows, sponge grounds, and cold water coral provinces combined, and what are the feedback loops with climate? How do these systems interact with pelagic food webs to influence fisheries thousands of kilometers away? Which of the hidden giants are actually the oldest continuous living systems on Earth, and how do their growth rates inform our understanding of ecological time? Answering these questions requires interdisciplinary programs that blend oceanography, genomics, geology, and climate science projects that can be visually and narratively rich for a documentary because they combine expedition footage, lab work, and human stories of discovery. There is also an urgent, almost cinematic conflict, the slow, patient growth of these systems versus the suddenness of human damage. A trawl net can tear a sponge field in an afternoon. A major bleaching event can turn a thriving coral province into a bleached skeleton in a single summer. That asymmetry provides a narrative engine for the documentary, show the ancient unfolding of these living structures across geological time, then contrast it with the compressed tempo of human disturbances, pollution, warming, industrial extraction that can destroy what nature took millennia to construct. The emotional frame is clear. The ocean contains wonders of slow, patient scale, and human actions risk erasing them before we have truly known them. Finally, there are reasons for cautious optimism. Advances in remote sensing, EDNA analysis, and autonomous systems mean that we can now map, monitor, and, in some cases, begin to rehabilitate parts of these systems. Marine protected areas are expanding in some regions. International coalitions and science consortia are drawing attention to deep-sea conservation. And public interest in ocean stories, the same interest that supported coral reef documentaries, can be mobilized to create political pressure. The technical challenge remains vast, but the ingredients for large-scale stewardship exist if we choose to use them. The documentary can end on a measured note. We have begun to see the ocean's biggest living systems, and in seeing them we have a chance to protect them. The question now is whether global society will act before these slow monuments are damaged beyond recovery. In the end, acknowledging that the largest living systems on Earth are underwater changes more than academic taxonomy. It changes how we view our planet, how we allocate scientific attention, and how we assign responsibility for stewardship. For centuries, we measured life with a terrestrial ruler. The ocean now demands a different scale, one of centuries and seafloor kilometers. The living systems we have only just begun to see are not remote curiosities. They are active, functional components of the Earth system that affect climate, food security, and biodiversity. Recognizing their magnitude forces and new humility, the planet's most impressive living structures need protection not because they are beautiful or strange, but because they do a job the rest of the biosphere depends on. If we value the future, then the next decade must be the one in which the ocean's largest living systems are mapped, understood, and defended. The tools are in our hands. The scientific will is forming. The public curiosity is ready. What remains is collective action, research funding, protective policy, and sustained attention. The ocean has been hiding giants for millennia now that we have found them. Our responsibility is clear.